Hello there, my sleepy hearts. Tonight, we follow the conflict that split a generation in two. Team Edward versus Team Jacob. The debate that turned readers into warriors and transformed a love story into a battlefield, where choosing sides felt like choosing who you were. This is the story of two boys who love the same girl. Two kinds of love that could not coexist. And one impossible choice that revealed what we believe love should be. When forever and humanity stand on opposite sides of the same heart. Before we start, I'd like to ask something of you guys. Please consider subscribing to help me reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Developing these theories requires deep research and careful dedication. And your support would mean more than I can express. Thank you. As you settle in, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can tell me in the comments. All right, let's get cozy now. Breathe in very slowly and let this journey through the greatest fandom war carry you gently into rest. Isabella Swan arrived in Forks, Washington in January of 2005, expecting nothing except rain and isolation and countdown to graduation that would release her from obligation to father, whose well-meaning awkwardness made their relationship loving but distant. Her plan being simple survival in small town, where she knew no one, and where her clumsiness and her preference for solitude would make her invisible among classmates who had known each other since childhood, and who would have no particular interest in Chief's daughter returning from Arizona, with her mother's restlessness and her own quiet resignation to circumstances beyond her control. Her first day at Forks High School brought routine embarrassments and routine kindnesses from students who were curious about New Girl, but not particularly invested in her permanent presence, their welcome being genuine but shallow, in ways that suited Bella perfectly when attention made her uncomfortable, and when she preferred observation to participation in social dynamics that required performance, she had no energy to maintain. The cafeteria during lunch period was loud and crowded and overwhelming in ways that made her want to disappear, but her new acquaintances were persistent in their friendliness and persistent in their inclusion of her at their table where conversation flowed around her, while she nodded and smiled and waited for day to end so she could return to Charlie's house and to books that were better company than teenagers whose concerns about weekend plans and dating drama seemed trivial compared to literature that explored actual human complexity. But then she saw them and everything about her careful plan for invisible existence shattered completely when 5 impossibly beautiful students entered cafeteria together, moving with grace that seemed choreographed and seemed otherworldly, their beauty being so extreme and so uniform that they appeared related despite different features and different coloring. their separation from rest of student body being obvious through their isolation at corner table, and through the way other students watched them with mixture of fascination and fear and resentment that came from being perpetually excluded from group, whose perfection made everyone else seem ordinary by comparison. Jessica Stanley's gossip identified them as Dr. Cullen's foster children. Her explanation, including names and pairings, that established Rosalie and Emmett as couple, and Alice and Jasper as couple, leaving Edward Cullen as the single one whose copper hair and whose sculpted features and whose complete disinterest in female attention, despite being most beautiful person Bella had ever seen, created immediate fascination that she tried to suppress but could not eliminate when his face kept drawing her attention across cafeteria in ways that made her forget to listen to Jessica's continued commentary about Cullen family's strangeness and Cullen family's wealth, and Dr. Cullen's mysterious past that no one knew anything concrete about despite years of speculation. Biology class second period brought her face to face with Edward Cullen, when assigned seating placed her at lab table beside him, his reaction to her presence being immediate and being visceral in ways that confused her and frightened her, when his body went rigid and his hand covered his nose, and his black eyes stared at her with expression that looked like hatred or like disgust or like something she could not identify, but that made her feel unwelcome and made her feel that she had done something wrong simply by existing in same space he occupied. His hour of tension beside her was excruciating, his body angled away from hers and his breathing controlled, and his obvious desire to be anywhere except beside her, making her wonder what she had done to provoke such extreme reaction when they had never spoken, and when she could not imagine any reason for stranger to hate her so intensely after mere minutes of proximity. His absence from school for following week created relief mixed with confusion, her assumption being that she had somehow offended him and that his departure was related to her presence, even though rational mind insisted that new student could not possibly have that much impact on someone who clearly had no interest in acknowledging her existence. His return the following Monday brought different Edward, his greeting being polite and his smile being friendly, and his golden eyes replacing black eyes that had stared at her with such hostility during their first encounter. The transformation being so complete that she questioned whether she had imagined his previous reaction or whether she had misinterpreted expression that might have been surprise rather than hatred. Their conversation during biology lab revealed intelligence and revealed charm that made his initial reaction seem even more inexplicable. His questions about her background and her reasons for moving to Forks demonstrating genuine interest that contradicted his previous rejection. His comments about Arizona weather and about her mother's remarriage, showing that he had been paying attention to details that Jessica had shared during cafeteria gossip session that he supposedly had not been listening to from across room. The contradiction between hostile stranger and charming conversationalist created confusion that Bella could not resolve, her attraction to him growing despite her awareness that something about him was wrong in ways she could not identify, but that her instincts recognized even when her conscious mind could not articulate specific concerns. The van incident in parking lot several weeks later confirmed that Edward Cullen was not normal human when Tyler's vehicle skidded on ice toward her with speed and trajectory that would crush her against her truck, her acceptance of death being instant and being calm when there was no time to move and no possibility of survival. But Edward appeared beside her despite having been across parking lot moments before, and his hand stopped Van's momentum. Despite physics, and despite Tyler's weight, and despite every law of nature suggesting that human body could not prevent multi-ton vehicle from completing its trajectory. His golden eyes met hers with intensity that promised silence and promised consequences if she spoke about what she had witnessed. His insistence that he had been standing beside her all along, being obvious lie that everyone accepted because alternative was acknowledging impossible, and acknowledging that Edward Cullen possessed capabilities that humans did not possess. Her research into Quileute legends and her discovery of stories about Cold Ones, who were natural enemies of wolf people, led her to confront Edward in meadow outside Forks, where sunlight revealed his true nature through skin that sparkled like diamonds, and through admission that he was vampire, whose existence should have ended centuries ago, but whose transformation had made him immortal predator, whose vegetarian diet of animal blood, rather than human blood, was unusual choice that most vampires rejected as unnecessary restriction of their nature. His confession that her blood appealed to him more strongly than any human's blood had appealed across his century of existence created danger and created attraction that transcended normal human romance. When choosing him meant choosing potential death, and when he struggled to resist killing her was constant battle that he won repeatedly, but that could fail at any moment if his control slipped or if circumstances created situation where instinct overwhelmed choice. Edward's revelation of his history provided context for understanding damaged soul, who had spent centuries searching for meaning and searching for reason to continue existing, when immortality without purpose was burden rather than gift. His transformation in 1918 during Spanish influenza epidemic, having saved his life but having also taken his humanity, and having made him creature whose nature was killing, despite his adoption of Carlyle Cullen's philosophy that vampires could choose compassion over violence and could choose to preserve human life rather than taking human life for sustenance that animal blood could provide adequately if not satisfyingly. His family's existence as coven of vegetarian vampires who lived among humans and who maintained human relationships through careful control and through constant vigilance created possibility of relationship that normal vampire existence would have made impossible. His ability to read thoughts of everyone except Bella, making her silence precious and making her mystery irresistible, when century of hearing every human's private thoughts had made genuine connection impossible, until girl whose mind was closed to his gift appeared in his biology class. The meadow conversations and the shared moments and the growing intimacy between them created foundation for love that transcended typical teenage romance. The stakes were literally life and death, when Edward's loss of control would kill her, and when his enemy's discovery of his attachment to human would make her target for vampires who might use her to hurt him or might kill her simply to prove point about vegetarian vampires' weakness and vegetarian vampires' foolish attachment to humans who are meant to be prey rather than being partners. His family's acceptance of her presence in Edward's life represented risk and represented trust, their welcome of human girlfriend, demonstrating that Cullens valued Edward's happiness enough to tolerate danger and tolerate complications that Bella's mortality created for family, whose peaceful existence depended on secrecy and depended on avoiding situations that might expose their nature or might create conflicts with other vampires, whose traditional lifestyles made them view Cullens as aberrations. James the Tracker's appearance during baseball game brought abstract danger into concrete reality, when nomadic vampires' hunting instincts focused on Bella with intensity that suggested her blood or her connection to Edward, triggered predatory response that would not be satisfied until she was dead, his patience and his intelligence making him formidable opponent, whose tracking abilities and whose willingness to use Bella's mother as bait demonstrated that Edward's fears about dating human were justified, and that loving Bella meant putting her in danger that human existence would not normally include. The hunt across multiple states and the eventual confrontation in Phoenix Ballet Studio, where James broke Bella's leg and bit her hand, brought her closer to death than Van incident had brought her. Edward's extraction of venom from her bloodstream, requiring him to taste her blood and requiring him to stop before he killed her, through draining her completely when instinct demanded completion, and when stopping required control that century of practice had developed, but that human blood threatened to overwhelm. Her recovery in hospital and her attendance at prom, despite leg casts, represented survival and represented Edward's victory over James and over his own nature. But their relationship's foundation had been established through crisis and through danger that demonstrated what loving Edward meant and what choosing Edward would require when his world was violent and when his existence attracted threats that normal human life would never encounter. His beauty and his devotion and his century of experience and his family's wealth and culture offered Bella escape from ordinary existence and offered belonging that she had never felt in Phoenix or in Forks. His love providing purpose and providing identity that transformed awkward teenager into central character in epic romance, where forever was possible and where aging and death could be avoided through transformation that Edward opposed, but that Bella increasingly desired. The foundation had been laid for Team Edward through demonstrating what he offered, and through demonstrating what choosing him would mean, his protective nature and his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for her safety, creating romantic narrative where vampires' love elevated human existence and where danger made devotion more meaningful because it was tested constantly and because it survived despite every reason for failure. Bella's 18th birthday party at Cullen House in September of 2006 should have been celebration, but Paper Cut and Jasper's attack and Edward's decision to leave Forks to protect Bella from his family's danger created ending that shattered everything and created void that would allow alternative to emerge from shadows where childhood friend had been waiting. Edward Cullen's departure from Bella's life in September of 2006 was surgical and was absolute. His final conversation in Forest near her house delivering message that he no longer loved her and that their relationship had been temporary distraction rather than eternal commitment, his lies being transparent, but his determination being complete when he believed that removing himself from her existence would protect her from dangers that his vampire nature created and would allow her to return to normal human life that would include college and marriage and aging and all experiences that dating vampire would prevent her from having. His promise that she would never see him again, and his family's immediate departure from Forks within hours eliminated every trace of Cullen presence except empty mansion, and except memories that Bella could not process or could not accept, when foundation of her identity had been constructed around Edward's love and around future that his departure had erased completely. The months following Edward's abandonment were characterized by catatonic grief that exceeded normal teenage heartbreak, because Bella's attachment to Edward had been obsessive and had been total in ways that made his absence feel like death rather than feeling like breakup. Her inability to function or to engage with life around her, creating concern from Charlie, who watched his daughter become hollow shell, whose mechanical performance of daily activities disguised complete emotional shutdown that therapy could not address, and that time did not heal when 4 months passed without improvement, and without any indication that she would recover from loss that had destroyed her capacity for joy or for hope, or for imagining future beyond empty, present. Her nightmares involved screaming and involved terror that woke Charlie repeatedly, her thrashing and her cries suggesting trauma, rather than suggesting normal dreams, but she could not or would not explain content of nightmares that revisited Edward's departure and revisited her abandonment in forest, where she had waited for death, rather than walking back to civilization when purpose for living had been removed and when continuing to exist seemed pointless. Charlie's patience wore thin as autumn became winter, and Bella's zombie existence continued without change. His threats to send her back to Renee in Florida, representing desperate attempt to shock her into recovery, or to remove her from Falk's environment that seemed to be perpetuating her depression, rather than allowing healing the change of scenery might facilitate. His ultimatum that she needed to engage with life or needed to leave created motivation that internal desire for recovery had not created. Her recognition that leaving Forks meant leaving last place Edward had been, and leaving location where memories were strongest, forcing her to perform normalcy, even though internal landscape remained devastated and remained empty in ways that socializing with Jessica or attending school functions could not repair, despite her efforts to convince Charlie that she was healing. Her reckless behavior during winter months involved seeking adrenaline and seeking danger that triggered auditory hallucinations of Edward's voice warning her against risky activities. Her discovery that danger produced his voice creating addiction and creating motivation to continue putting herself in situations that rational person would avoid when hearing dead boyfriend's voice seemed worth any risk and seemed like only connection to him that remained available after his complete disappearance from her life. Her purchase of broken motorcycles from salvage yard represented opportunity to engage in dangerous activity that would require help and would require a companion who possessed mechanical knowledge that she lacked. Her memory of Jacob Black from childhood visits to La Push suggested that Charlie's best friend's son might be willing to help rebuild motorcycles in exchange for one of finished bikes. Jacob Black had grown since Bella's previous visit to La Push. Before Edward's arrival had consumed her attention completely. His height increase and his muscle development and his warm smile and his obvious pleasure at seeing her again, creating easy friendship that felt comfortable rather than feeling intense in ways that Edward's presence had always felt intense when vampires' supernatural beauty and vampires' dangerous nature made every interaction feel charged with significance. Jacob's willingness to help with motorcycle project and his mechanical talent and his patient teaching created routine where Bella visited Le Push garage regularly, and where hours passed in comfortable work and comfortable conversation that felt healing in ways she had not expected, when Jacob's warmth and Jacob's humor gradually penetrated fog that had surrounded her since Edward's departure. The friendship deepened across weeks of working on motorcycles together. Jacob's easy affection and his obvious growing feelings for Bella, creating complication that she recognized but chose to ignore when his presence made life bearable again, and when losing his friendship would mean returning to isolation that had nearly destroyed her during autumn months. His transformation during February was sudden and was complete. His disappearance from her life without explanation, creating panic and creating sense of abandonment that echoed Edward's departure when Jacob had become lifeline and had become reason to continue existing beyond simple mechanical performance of daily activities that Charlie required. Her desperate attempts to maintain contact with Jacob through visits to his house were blocked by Billy Black, whose explanations about mononucleosis were obvious lies that failed to explain why Jacob avoided her completely, and why he would not take her phone calls or would not respond to her messages. The rejection feeling like second abandonment, and feeling like confirmation that everyone she loved would eventually leave her when attachment created vulnerability, that universe exploited through taking away anyone who mattered. The discovery that Jacob had joined Sam Yuli's group and had cut his hair and had adopted hostile demeanor toward her represented transformation that she could not understand. His new friends and his new priorities, apparently not including friendship with Girl, who had relied on him completely during months when he had been only source of light in darkness that Edward's departure had created. Jacob's eventual explanation that he was werewolf, whose transformation had been triggered by vampire presence in area, revealed secret and revealed burden that supernatural world had imposed on Cullen boys, whose genetics made them protectors against cold ones, who were natural enemies according to ancient treaty and according to biological imperatives that made vampires and werewolves hate each other instinctively. His revelation that Sam Yuli's group was actually Wolfpack, whose purpose was protecting tribe from vampire threats, created context for understanding his disappearance and created framework for understanding why his friendship with Bella had become complicated when her association with Cullens made her suspect and made her potentially dangerous to tribe whose safety depended on maintaining boundaries between human world and vampire world. The reconciliation between Bella and Jacob after his revelation created renewed friendship that was deeper than previous friendship, because shared knowledge of supernatural world created bond and created understanding that normal humans could not provide. His pack brothers accepting her presence despite her connection to vampires and despite their instinctive hatred of cold ones, because Jacob's imprinting potential and Jacob's position within pack made his relationships important to pack dynamics and important to maintaining his happiness that affected his effectiveness as pack member. The easy hours spent on La Push Beach and the comfortable conversations and the physical warmth of Jacob's presence created healing that Bella had not experienced during months of Edward's absence. Jacob's humanity and Jacob's availability making him present in ways that Edward's supernatural nature and Edward's protective distance had never allowed even during their relationship. Jacob's confession of love during March came as surprise and came as complication that Bella recognized but could not reciprocate fully when her heart remained broken and remained attached to Edward despite months of absence and despite Edward's clear message that their relationship was over and that he would not return. Her inability to love Jacob the way he deserved to be loved created guilt and created awareness that she was using his affection and his presence as substitute for Edward, rather than appreciating Jacob as separate person who deserved to be chosen, rather than being accepted as consolation prize. But her selfish need for his companionship and her recognition that losing him would return her to zombie existence made her maintain friendship despite knowing that her continued presence in his life was preventing him from moving on and was giving him false hope that she might eventually return feelings that he had declared. The months of spring 2006 brought growing intimacy between Bella and Jacob that felt like falling in love, even though Bella's internal awareness insisted that what she felt for Jacob was different from what she had felt for Edward. When Edward's absence created constant ache and constant awareness that Jacob was filling void rather than creating new space in heart that remained dominated by vampire who had abandoned her. Jacob's patience with her limitations and his willingness to accept whatever affection she could offer created relationship that was unbalanced and was potentially harmful to both of them. When Bella's inability to commit fully meant that Jacob remained hopeful while Bella remained trapped between past love that would not release her and present love that she could not fully embrace. Her cliff diving in March was a reckless attempt to hear Edward's voice through engaging in dangerous activity. The high cliff and the rough water and the storm making jump particularly risky, but making hallucination of Edward's voice particularly strong when danger level corresponded directly to volume and clarity of warning that her mind manufactured through grief and through desperate need for connection. Jacob's rescue from water after she jumped and after current pulled her under demonstrated his protective nature and demonstrated that someone was present and was saving her when Edward's voice was only hallucination and was only manifestation of her broken psyche rather than being actual presence that could help during crisis. Alice Cullen's unexpected arrival in Forks following her vision of Bella's cliff jump represented intrusion from vampire world and represented complication. When Alice's presence triggered Jacob's wolf instincts and triggered his hostility toward vampire whose appearance in Bella's house created territorial response and created reminder that Bella existed between two worlds that could not coexist peacefully. Alice's explanation that she had seen Bella jump and had assumed suicide rather than recognizing reckless behavior revealed that Edward's family still monitored Bella's life from distance and revealed that Edward still cared despite his departure and despite his insistence that relationship was over. Her presence creating hope and creating renewed pain when Bella learned that Edward had left to protect her rather than leaving because he stopped loving her as he had claimed. The phone call from Edward to Charlie's house while Alice was present and while Jacob answered created misunderstanding that would drive Edward to Italy and would drive Bella to follow. When Jacob's announcement that Charlie was at a funeral combined with Edward's assumption that Bella was dead created crisis where Edward's decision to provoke Volturi into destroying him represented suicide attempt that mirrored Bella's cliff jump, and that demonstrated that Edward's love had not diminished despite his departure and despite months of separation. Alice's vision of Edward's plans and Alice's decision to take Bella to Italy to prevent Edward's death created urgency and created mission that would reunite them despite Edward's intentions and despite his belief that keeping Bella safe required staying away permanently. The reunion in Volterra was desperate and was passionate and was immediate confirmation that Edward's departure had been mistake-motivated by excessive fear rather than by absence of love. His shock at seeing Bella alive and his joy at discovering that she had not died competing with his horror that she had come to Italy and had put herself in Volturi's path. When ancient vampires' awareness of human, who knew vampire secrets, created danger that Edward's original departure had been intended to prevent. The Volturi's ultimatum that Bella must be transformed or must be killed to prevent her knowledge from threatening vampire secrecy created timeline and created requirement that Edward's departure had failed to avoid. His attempt to protect her from a vampire world having ultimately failed when Alice's vision of Bella's future transformation convinced Aro to allow them to leave Italy alive with understanding that Bella's humanity was temporary condition that would be corrected through transformation within reasonable time frame. The return to Forks brought Edward back into Bella's life permanently, but brought complication, where Jacob's place in Bella's life during Edward's absence created love triangle and created situation where Bella's heart was divided between vampire who had abandoned her and werewolf who had stayed and had healed her when abandonment nearly destroyed her completely. Jacob's rage at Edward's return and his heartbreak at Bella's immediate reunion with vampire who had caused her months of suffering created rift and created a beginning of conflict that would define Eclipse and would split readers into teams based on who they believed deserved Bella's love and who they believed represented better choice for her future. Edward Cullen's return to Forks and to Bella's life in March of 2006 brought immediate reunion and immediate resumption of relationship that his departure had interrupted but had not actually ended when Bella's love had remained constant despite months of grief and despite her growing attachment to Jacob, whose presence during Edward's absence had created complication that neither vampire nor human had anticipated. Edward's assumption that his return would erase months of separation and would restore their relationship to previous state ignored reality that Bella had changed during his absence and that Jacob had become an essential part of her life rather than remaining distant childhood friend whose significance was minimal compared to epic romance with vampire who offered eternity and offered escape from ordinary human existence. The Volturi ultimatum requiring Bella's transformation within reasonable time frame created pressure and created timeline that Edward resisted despite understanding that refusing would result in Volturian forces arriving to kill Bella or to transform her forcibly when ancient vampires' authority was absolute and their patience was limited regarding humans who knew vampire secrets and who represented potential exposure risk. Edward's proposal of marriage as condition for his agreement to transform Bella represented his attempt to maintain some control over situation and represented his traditional values that required formal commitment before physical intimacy or before transformation that would bind them together across eternity. His insistence on human experiences including wedding and honeymoon before vampire transformation, demonstrating his desire to preserve her humanity as long as possible, despite Volturi timeline making extended delay dangerous. Jacob's discovery of Edward's return, and Jacob's rage at Bella's immediate reunion with vampire who had abandoned her, created confrontation and created ultimatum, where Jacob demanded that Bella choose between them, and demanded that she acknowledge what Edward's departure had cost her, and what Jacob's presence had given her during months when she had been broken, and when Jacob had been only person capable of making her smile. His accusation that Bella was choosing vampire who had proven unreliable over werewolf who had stayed and who had loved her consistently, represented legitimate grievance and represented pain that Bella recognized but could not resolve when her love for Edward was obsessive and was consuming in ways that her affection for Jacob could not match, despite Jacob's deserving better treatment, and despite her awareness that choosing Edward meant hurting Jacob deliberately. The engagement ring that Edward presented represented formal commitment and represented promise of human experience before vampire transformation. The massive diamond's value and beauty symbolizing Edward's wealth and Edward's desire to give Bella everything that money could provide, even though what she wanted most was transformation and was eternity with him, rather than expensive jewelry or elaborate wedding that his traditional values required as prerequisite. Her acceptance of proposal, despite her discomfort with formal engagement, and despite her awareness that marriage announcement would devastate, Jacob represented choice and represented prioritization of Edward's desires over Jacob's feelings when maintaining relationship with both of them was becoming impossible as their mutual hostility increased, and as their demands for her exclusive loyalty became more insistent. The newborn army crisis emerging in Seattle during spring of 2006 brought external threat that required cooperation between Cullen's and Quileute Pack, despite their natural enmity and despite their personal conflicts over Bella, whose connection to both groups made her bridge between species whose treaty and whose biological hatred made alliance unusual and made collaboration difficult. Victoria's revenge plot targeting Bella for James's death demonstrated that Edward's fears about Bella's safety were justified, and demonstrated that loving her meant putting her in constant danger from vampires who might use her to hurt Edward, or might kill her simply to settle scores that had nothing to do with Bella herself, but everything to do with her attachment to vampire whose vegetarian lifestyle and whose protection of humans made him target for traditional vampires who viewed his choices as weakness. The training sessions where Cullens and wolves learned to fight together against newborn army created forced proximity between Edward and Jacob, whose hostility toward each other was managed through focus on common enemy and through recognition that Bella's survival required their cooperation despite their personal animosity. Jasper's instruction on newborn fighting techniques and his warnings about newborn strength that exceeded even experienced vampire capabilities during first year after transformation demonstrated tactical necessities and demonstrated that battle would be dangerous even with combined forces when Victoria's army numbered over 20 newborns whose mindless aggression and whose supernatural strength made them formidable opponents despite their lack of strategy or lack of discipline. The tent scene on Mountain before battle brought Edward and Jacob together in situation where Bella's survival required Jacob's body heat to prevent hypothermia that Vampire's cold body could not address. The night spent in sleeping bag with Jacob, while Edward watched helplessly, created intimacy and created conversation between rivals that revealed their different perspectives and revealed their different claims on Bella's affection. Edward's acknowledgement that Jacob could give Bella human life and human experiences, including aging and children, represented his recognition that vampire transformation meant losses that were permanent and were significant. His admission that he would choose Jacob for Bella if he were capable of selflessness, competing with his awareness that he could not actually let her go when his love was too consuming and too desperate to allow noble sacrifice. Jacob's argument that he represented better choice and healthier choice because he could offer Bella normalcy and could offer her life without constant danger resonated with logic, even though Bella's heart rejected premise when her love for Edward transcended rational assessment of who would be better partner or who would provide safer existence. The conversation between vampire and werewolf revealed that both loved Bella genuinely and both believed they could make her happy. Their different visions of her future representing different values and different definitions of what love should provide when Edward offered eternity and intensity, while Jacob offered humanity and simplicity. Bella's visit to Jacob's tent before battle brought confession that she had been avoiding and brought acknowledgement that she loved Jacob too, but differently than she loved Edward. Her recognition that Jacob held piece of her heart created validation for his hope and created complication for a previously clear choice when admitting feelings made them real rather than allowing them to remain unspoken and unacknowledged. Jacob's demand for kiss and Bella's eventual compliance represented a moment where she allowed herself to feel what she had been suppressing. The kiss revealing that her attraction to Jacob was genuine and was powerful, even though it could not overcome her obsessive attachment to Edward, whose pull remained stronger despite Jacob's warmth and despite Jacob's availability. The battle against Victoria's newborn army demonstrated cooperation between Cullen's and Pack, whose coordination and whose combined abilities allowed victory despite being outnumbered. Edward's destruction of Victoria, eliminating threat, and eliminating vampire whose patience and whose intelligence had made her dangerous opponent capable of creating army and capable of nearly succeeding in revenge plot that months of planning had constructed. Jacob's injury during battle when newborn crushed bones in his right side created guilt among Cullens, who recognized that Werewolf Alliance had cost Pack member his health and had demonstrated that helping vampires carried real risks for shapeshifters whose participation had been essential but whose bodies were not indestructible despite their supernatural healing capabilities. Bella's vigil at Jacob's bedside during his recovery brought renewed intimacy and brought her confession that she loved him and that choosing Edward meant sacrificing possibility of life with Jacob. That part of her wanted despite her inability to choose it when Edward's pull was too strong and when her desire for vampire transformation made human future with Jacob impossible, even though that future included warmth and included experiences that vampire existence would forever deny. Jacob's heartbreak at her admission that she loved him but was choosing Edward anyway represented cruelty of situation where being loved was not enough, when being loved less than rival meant losing regardless of one's own worthiness or one's own devotion. The wedding planning, proceeding despite Jacob's pain and despite love triangle reaching peak of its intensity, demonstrated Bella's commitment to Edward and demonstrated her acceptance that hurting Jacob was necessary cost of choosing Edward when having both was impossible, and when delaying choice only prolonged suffering for all three of them. The divide between Team Edward and Team Jacob reached its height during Eclipse, because both sides had legitimate arguments, and both sides had demonstrated genuine love, and both sides offered Bella different futures that represented different values about what mattered most in romantic partnership, when eternity competed with humanity, and when intensity competed with comfort. Edward Cullen embodied the tortured hero archetype that literature had romanticized across centuries. His existence as vampire who chose compassion over violence and who struggled against his own nature to protect humans, rather than hunting them, representing moral complexity and representing internal conflict that made him compelling beyond simple physical beauty that would have been sufficient to attract attention, but that became almost irrelevant compared to psychological depth. That century of existence and century of wrestling with questions about soul and damnation had created. His transformation in 1918 during Spanish influenza epidemic had occurred when he was 17 years old and dying, his human life being cut short before he could experience adulthood or could make choices about career or family or future that death from illness would have prevented. His mother, Elizabeth Mason's dying request that Carlyle save her son by any means necessary, giving Carlyle permission to transform Edward without Edward's explicit consent, when unconscious boy could not agree or refuse offer of immortality that would define his existence across following century. His century of solitude before meeting Bella had been marked by his inability to connect with anyone, whose thoughts he could read constantly, and whose private motivations and whose hidden darkness he witnessed through telepathy that made genuine intimacy impossible. When knowing everything about person eliminated mystery and eliminated possibility of discovery that romantic love required. His telepathic gift that allowed him to hear thoughts of everyone within several mile radius meant that he experienced humanity's internal landscape continuously and involuntarily. His awareness of people's hidden cruelties and hidden selfishness and hidden darkness, creating cynicism and creating isolation, when knowing everyone's secrets made forming genuine relationships impossible, because he could never experience surprise or could never trust that someone's external presentation matched their internal reality that his gift revealed without permission or without filter. His decade of rebellion during 1920s, when he left Carlyle's family and fed on humans who were themselves murderers and criminals, represented his attempt to justify vampire nature through vigilante justice, his reading of victims' thoughts allowing him to target those who deserved death, according to his moral framework, when rapists and murderers and abusers could be identified through their own memories and their own thoughts that revealed their guilt and revealed their intentions to harm others. His hunting of evil humans rather than hunting innocents represented compromise between vampire nature and moral conscience. His belief being that some deaths serve justice and that his predation could be righteous rather than being purely destructive. but his eventual return to Carlisle and to vegetarian lifestyle after a decade of human blood demonstrated his recognition that taking human life corrupted him regardless of victim's guilt, and that his father's philosophy was only sustainable path for vampire who wanted to retain humanity and wanted to believe that souls survived transformation despite theological questions about whether vampires were damned. His devotion to Bella transcended normal romantic attachment because her silence to his telepathy made her mystery and made her unknowable in ways that no one else in his century of existence had been unknowable. Her thoughts being private and her motivations being hidden created fascination that was amplified by bloodlust and by recognition that her blood appealed to him more strongly than any human's blood had appealed. When her scent and her presence triggered predatory instincts that century of control had developed, but that her specific biology threatened to overwhelm. His description of her blood as his personal brand of heroin revealed intensity of temptation and revealed that being near her required constant battle against instincts that wanted to drain her completely and that wanted to kill her. Despite his love and despite his conscious commitment to her survival, his struggle to be near her without killing her represented daily heroism and daily sacrifice that humans in relationship did not experience when their love being tested constantly through proximity to temptation that could destroy beloved in moment of weakness or moment of accident. What Edward offered Bella extended beyond romantic love into complete transformation of her existence. His wealth accumulated through Carlisle's investments across centuries and through Alice's stock market precognition, providing unlimited resources and providing access to experiences and education and culture that middle-class police chief's daughter would never access through normal human means. His casual references to Ivy League education and to private islands and to luxury vehicles and to designer clothing demonstrated life of privilege that transcended normal human wealth, when century of compound interest and supernatural advantages in business dealings had created fortune that allowed Cullens to live comfortably and to pursue interests without financial constraints that limited normal families. The Cullen family represented instant belonging and instant acceptance. Their wealth and their sophistication and their supernatural abilities creating family unit that was extraordinary and that was exclusive. Bella's entry into their circle elevating her from ordinary teenager into member of supernatural elite, whose existence transcended human limitations and human mortality that made normal teenage concerns seem trivial by comparison. His protectiveness manifested through constant vigilance and through interference in Bella's choices that he deemed dangerous. His watching her sleep without her knowledge for months, before she discovered his nightly presence, and his disabling her truck to prevent her from visiting Jacob, and his attempts to control her interactions and her activities, representing behavior that many readers interpreted as romantic devotion, demonstrating how much he cared, while others interpreted as controlling abuse that prioritized his judgment over her autonomy and that violated her privacy and her right to make own decisions about relationships and activities. His century of experience and his supernatural abilities created power imbalance, where he possessed knowledge and capabilities that she lacked, their relationship being inherently unequal, when he could read everyone else's thoughts and could move with supernatural speed and could overpower her physically without effort. if he chose to exert force rather than requesting compliance with his preferences about her safety and her choices. His view of Bella as his salvation and as his reason for continuing to exist across eternity, that had previously felt purposeless, created intensity and created devotion that was absolute. His willingness to die rather than exist, without her demonstrating depth of attachment, but also demonstrating unhealthy codependence, where her existence became necessary for his continued will to live, rather than being enhancement to already fulfilling existence. His statements that before her he had merely existed rather than lived, and that she was his life now revealed that century of searching for meaning had failed until she appeared. Her presence giving him purpose and giving him reason to embrace immortality that he had previously viewed as burden rather than as gift, when eternal existence without connection felt empty regardless of wealth or capabilities or experiences that money and time could provide. His belief that he was damned and soulless made her acceptance of him feel like redemption. Her insistence that he possessed soul and a rejection of his self-loathing providing validation and providing purpose, that century of moral struggle had not provided, when his vegetarian lifestyle felt like inadequate penance for vampire nature that he viewed as inherently evil, regardless of his choices about how to express that nature. His theological concerns about damnation and about whether vampires retain souls, or whether transformation destroyed spiritual essence, along with human mortality, created existential crisis that Bella's faith in his goodness partially resolved through her absolute conviction that his compassion and his choices proved existence of soul that theological doctrine might deny, but that empirical evidence of his character confirmed. The transformation he offered represented escape from mortality, an escape from aging, an escape from death that humans accepted as inevitable, but that vampire transformation could prevent through crystallizing body into immortal form that would never age and would never sicken and would never die, except through violence or fire that could destroy even vampires' enhanced durability. His promise of eternity together meant that relationship would not be limited by human lifespan or limited by deterioration that aging created. Their love potentially lasting centuries or millennia without diminishment and without separation, except through choice or through catastrophic violence that could destroy even supernatural beings whose existence otherwise continued indefinitely without natural expiration. The cultural refinement and intellectual stimulation that Edward provided through his century of education and his exposure to art and music and literature across decades of cultural evolution offered Bella access to knowledge and appreciation that normal teenage boyfriend could never provide, when Edward had witnessed historical events firsthand and had accumulated expertise in multiple fields through decades of study that immortality allowed. His ability to discuss literature and philosophy and music with depth that came from century of engagement made conversations intellectually stimulating in ways that high school peers could not replicate. His recommendations and his teaching elevating her understanding and expanding her worldview beyond limitations of small-town education and small-town experience, but choosing Edward meant accepting losses that were permanent and were irreversible, her transformation requiring death of her human self and requiring surrender of experiences including sunlight that would burn vampire skin and sleep that vampire body did not require, and biological children that vampire crystalline structure could not create. and aging alongside human family whose lives would continue while she remained frozen at age 18 or 19, depending on transformation timing. His opposition to her transformation, despite Volturi ultimatum requiring it, demonstrated his belief that humanity was precious and that vampire existence was curse rather than blessing. His desire to preserve her mortality representing his view that what he offered was damnation disguised as gift, and that loving her meant wanting better for her than what he possessed himself, even though his desire to keep her forever competed with his conviction that transformation would destroy something essential about her humanity. The problematic elements of their relationship, including his controlling behavior and his centuries of power advantage and his stalking that began before they formally met, and his interference in her autonomy through sabotaging her vehicle and through attempting to dictate her friendships, competed with genuine love and genuine self-sacrifice that manifested through his willingness to leave her to protect her, and through his constant battle against instincts that wanted to kill her, when loving her meant fighting his own nature every moment they spent together. Team Edward formed around readers who viewed his devotion as romantic and who valued intensity and passion and eternal commitment over healthy relationship dynamics or over equal partnership. Their interpretation of his control as protection, rather than as abuse, representing different values about what love should look like and what acceptable behavior was within romantic contexts where supernatural stakes and supernatural dangers potentially justified extraordinary measures. His darkness and his century of pain created damaged soul who needed saving. Bella's role as his savior and as his reason for existing, providing her with purpose and providing her with identity that transcended ordinary teenage existence, where she had felt invisible and had felt unremarkable, before vampires' obsessive attention elevated her into protagonist of epic supernatural romance, where she mattered completely and where her choices had life or death consequences that made every decision significant rather than mundane. Jacob Black represented the path not taken and the life that Bella could have lived if vampires had never entered her existence, his humanity and his warmth and his complete accessibility offering alternative to supernatural intensity that Edward embodied when Jacob's presence meant normalcy and meant possibility of aging together and meant future that included children and sunlight and awe, experiences that vampire transformation would permanently eliminate. His transformation into werewolf complicated his humanity, but did not eliminate it when shapeshifter nature was biological rather than being supernatural curse. His ability to age and his ability to have children and his continued connection to human world through family and through tribe, making him fundamentally different from vampires whose transformation severed them from humanity completely and irreversibly. His role as Bella's best friend before becoming romantic interest created foundation of genuine compatibility and genuine understanding that was built through shared experiences and through time spent together, doing ordinary activities like repairing motorcycles and walking on beach and talking about everything and nothing in ways that friendships allowed, but that intense romantic relationship sometimes prevented when passion overwhelmed comfortable companionship. His easy humor and his lack of pretension and his willingness to be silly and playful created lightness that Edward's century of existence and Edward's constant vigilance about danger and Edward's brooding intensity never allowed. Jacob's youth and Jacob's optimism, making time with him feel refreshing and feel simple in ways that time with Edward felt weighty and felt significant, when every moment carried supernatural stakes. The Quileute Reservation and the Wolf Pack represented community and represented belonging that was based on shared heritage and shared purpose, rather than being based on chosen family of supernatural beings whose only connection was their vampire nature and their shared commitment to vegetarian lifestyle. Jacob's integration into a pack of boys who had grown up together and who protected tribe together created bonds of brotherhood and created support system that was organic rather than being constructed. His position within pack hierarchy and his eventual role as beta to Sam's alpha, demonstrating leadership capabilities and demonstrating that his identity extended beyond his relationship with Bella, when pack responsibilities and pack loyalty competed with his desire to be near her constantly. What Jacob offered Bella was fundamentally human life with supernatural enhancement rather than supernatural existence that required abandoning humanity completely. His proposal that she could stay human and could be with him and could have normal experiences including college and career and eventual family represented future that preserved her connection to Charlie and preserved her ability to participate in human world without needing to fake her own death, or without needing to disappear from everyone she had known before vampire transformation. His vision of their future together included growing old side by side and included watching children grow and included all mundane, beautiful, ordinary experiences that mortality provided and that immortality eliminated when vampire existence was fundamentally about stasis rather than being about growth and change that human aging represented. His youth worked in his favor and worked against him simultaneously. His 16 years compared to Edward's century plus 17, creating power balance that was more equal when Jacob and Bella were peers navigating adolescence together, rather than Jacob being protected and taught by a partner whose experience exceeded his by factor that made genuine equality impossible. But his youth also meant limited life experience and meant personality that was still developing and meant future that was uncertain. When teenagers changed dramatically between 16 and 26, and when promising relationship at 16 could become incompatible partnership at 26, after growth and change revealed fundamental differences that adolescent passion had obscured. His love for Bella was uncomplicated and was freely chosen, rather than being result of supernatural bond or supernatural attraction. His decision to love her representing active choice, rather than representing inevitable response to mate whose blood called to him or whose scent triggered biological imperatives that choice could moderate but could not eliminate. His statement that he would love her even if imprinting existed, and even if he never imprinted on anyone else, demonstrated that his feelings were genuine and were based on knowing her and appreciating her, rather than being based on supernatural compulsion or based on century of loneliness, making first interesting person seem like only possible partner. The imprint concept that governed Wolfpack romantic attachments created both reassurance and concern regarding Jacob's devotion, his resistance to imprinting on anyone during months of knowing Bella and loving Bella, suggesting that perhaps she was his natural mate, even without supernatural bond confirming compatibility, but possibility that he could imprint on stranger at any moment and could have his feelings redirected completely and involuntarily created uncertainty and created potential for abandonment that was beyond anyone's control when imprinting overrode all previous attachments and all previous commitments through biological imperative that wolves could not resist. His pain at being second choice and his awareness that Bella loved him but loved Edward more created tragedy that was different from typical romantic rejection, because Bella acknowledged love in him and acknowledged that part of her wanted life with him but could not choose him when Edward's pull was stronger and when her desire for vampire transformation made human future impossible regardless of how much she cared for Jacob. His statement that he would wait for her and would always be there represented devotion that was patient and was enduring. His hope that she might eventually choose him, competing with his growing awareness that her choice of Edward was final and was not temporary infatuation that would fade with time or with Edward's inevitable mistakes. His anger and his bitterness during eclipse when Edward returned and when Bella immediately reunited with Vampire, who had abandoned her, represented legitimate grievance and represented frustration that he had been there during her darkest months and had healed her and had loved her consistently, only to be discarded once Edward decided to return and decided he wanted her back. His accusations that Edward was manipulative and was controlling resonated with readers who viewed Edward's behavior as problematic. Jacob's advocacy for Bella's autonomy and Jacob's encouragement of her making own choices without Edward's interference, positioning him as healthier alternative, who respected her agency rather than attempting to control her decisions. The physicality of his warmth contrasted dramatically with Edward's cold stone skin, Jacob's elevated body temperature, and his ability to provide physical comfort through warmth that Bella craved creating, sensory pleasure, and creating physical compatibility that Edward's vampire nature prevented when his touch was always cold and always required Bella to tolerate discomfort for sake of being close to him. The ease of physical affection with Jacob, who could hug her and hold her without fearing that he might lose control and might kill her, created safety and created spontaneity that relationship with Edward could never include, when every touch required calculation and required Edward's constant vigilance about his strength and about his thirst. What choosing Jacob would have meant extended beyond romantic relationship into choosing particular kind of life that valued community over isolation, and valued growth over stasis, and valued humanity over supernatural existence. His world being grounded in reservation and in pack and in protecting tribe, rather than being grounded in hiding from humans and in pretending to be something other than what one actually was. The Quileute traditions and the pack bonds and the connection to land and to ancestry created richness and created meaning. That Cullen existence, with its constant relocations and its performance of humanity and its separation from human community, could not replicate. Despite wealth and despite sophistication that centuries of existence had accumulated, his mortality represented both his appeal and his limitation, his human lifespan, meaning that growing old together would involve actual aging and actual change, rather than eternal repetition of same experiences across centuries, where novelty would eventually fade and where existence might become boring, despite best intentions and despite genuine love. But his mortality also meant urgency, and meant that time together was precious, because it was limited, their human years having weight and having significance, that immortal centuries might not carry, when unlimited time made individual moments less valuable through removing scarcity that made mortal experiences meaningful. The healthy relationship dynamics that Jacob offered through respecting Bella's choices and through encouraging her autonomy and through being available without being possessive created partnership that was more balanced than relationship with Edward, whose controlling tendencies and whose interference in her decisions demonstrated problematic patterns that some readers defended as necessary protection, while other readers condemned as abuse disguised as devotion. Jacob's willingness to let Bella make own mistakes and his trust in her judgment, even when he disagreed with her choices, positioned him as partner who viewed her as equal rather than as fragile human, requiring constant supervision and constant protection from herself and from world. His integration into Bella's human life through his friendship with Charlie and his acceptance by her father created family dynamic that Edward's relationship with Charlie never achieved, despite Charlie's respect for Edward's politeness and despite Charlie's appreciation for Edward's obvious devotion to Bella, when Charlie instinctively trusted Jacob and instinctively preferred Jacob as Bella's boyfriend, even though he could not articulate specific reasons beyond feeling that Jacob was safer choice and was more appropriate choice for teenage daughter. The ease of Jacob's presence in Swan household and the comfort of his belonging contrasted with Edward's formal distance and Edward's inability to truly connect with Charlie beyond superficial pleasantries that maintain civility without creating genuine relationship. Team Jacob formed around readers who valued emotional health and valued human experience, and valued relationships that were equal and were based on mutual respect, rather than being based on obsessive intensity and power imbalance that characterized Bella and Edward's dynamic. Their interpretation of Jacob as better man and as healthier choice represented values that prioritized Bella's well-being over romantic fantasy. Their frustration with her choice of Edward reflecting belief that love should enhance rather than consume and should empower rather than control when healthy partnerships allowed both people to maintain identity and maintain autonomy rather than requiring complete submission to stronger partners' will. His eventual acceptance of Bella's choice and his painful recognition that he had lost demonstrated maturity and demonstrated growth. His acknowledgement that loving someone meant wanting their happiness even when their happiness did not include him, representing selfless love that competed with Edward's possessive devotion, for which version represented truer expression of love, when one allowed beloved to make own choices, and one attempted to control beloved's choices through interference justified as protection. The tragedy of Jacob's position was not that he was unworthy or was inadequate, but was simply that he was not Edward, and that Bella's heart had chosen obsessive intensity over comfortable partnership when both options had merit, and when either choice would have involved gains and losses that made decision genuinely difficult, rather than being obviously correct choice that one option clearly superior to other. Isabella Swan existed at center of conflict that was not of her making, but that required her resolution, her position between vampire and werewolf, and between two versions of future that were mutually exclusive, creating burden that 18-year-old girl should not have been required to carry when choosing one meant destroying other, and when both options represented genuine love from people who deserved better than being second choice or being choice made through elimination rather than through pure preference. Her agency in situation was complicated by power dynamics and by circumstances that limited her options when staying human meant eventually dying and leaving Edward, or meant being killed by Volturi for knowing vampire secrets, while choosing vampire transformation meant hurting Jacob and meant surrendering humanity that he believed was precious and that Edward himself believed she should not sacrifice despite his desire to keep her forever. The criticism of Bella as weak protagonist, who allowed men to make decisions for her and who defined herself through romantic relationships rather than developing independent identity, competed with recognition that her circumstances were extraordinary and that navigating supernatural world while maintaining human vulnerability required assistance and required protection that she could not provide for herself when vampires and werewolves possessed capabilities that rendered her helpless in situations where physical strength or supernatural abilities determine outcomes. Her choices throughout Saga demonstrated agency and demonstrated decisiveness, even when those choices were controversial or were self-destructive. Her pursuit of Edward despite danger, and her then choice to become vampire despite opposition, and her willingness to sacrifice herself repeatedly for people she loved, revealing character who knew what she wanted and who pursued it regardless of obstacles or regardless of others' preferences about what she should choose. Her love for Edward was consuming and was obsessive in ways that transcended normal teenage infatuation. Her willingness to die for him and her desire to become vampire and her inability to imagine future without him demonstrating depth of attachment that some readers interpreted as true love, while other readers interpreted as unhealthy codependence that elevated romantic relationship above all other considerations, including family and including self-preservation and including experiences that mortality uniquely provided. Her descriptions of physical pain during his absence and her catatonic depression when he left, and her immediate willingness to forgive abandonment demonstrated that her attachment had qualities of addiction rather than qualities of balanced partnership. Her need for him exceeding healthy bounds and creating relationship where his presence was necessary for her functioning rather than being enhancement to already complete existence. Her love for Jacob developed differently and existed alongside Edward's obsession rather than replacing it. Her recognition that she loved Jacob but loved him differently, creating complicated emotional landscape where both loves were genuine but were not equivalent when Edward's pull was visceral and immediate, while Jacob's appeal was comfortable and gradual. Her awareness that choosing Edward meant hurting Jacob, and her guilt about using Jacob's affection and his presence during Edward's absence created moral complexity, where her actions had consequences that she recognized but chose to accept, when alternative of losing Jacob's friendship seemed worse than maintaining relationship that gave him false hope and that prevented him from moving on to someone who could love him without reservation. The 10-scene confession where she admitted loving Jacob represented a moment of honesty that complicated rather than clarified situation. Her acknowledgement that he held piece of her heart validating his hope, while simultaneously confirming that piece was smaller than Edward's claim and was insufficient to change her ultimate choice. Her statement that in different universe or different circumstances, she could have chosen Jacob and could have been happy with him, demonstrated that her preference for Edward was not absolute judgment about superior worth, but was a result of specific attachment that had formed first, and had formed completely before Jacob became romantic option, rather than remaining childhood friend, whose significance was minimal compared to epic vampire romance. Her choice of Edward was active decision, rather than passive acceptance, despite criticisms that she simply allowed events to carry her forward. Her insistence on vampire transformation, despite Edward's opposition, and despite recognition of what transformation would cost, demonstrated that she knew what she wanted and pursued it against resistance from person whose opinion mattered most. When Edward's desire to preserve her humanity competed with her desire for eternity with him. Her negotiation of terms, including marriage before transformation, and her willingness to wait for his timeline, rather than demanding immediate transformation, showed compromise and showed respect for his preferences while maintaining her ultimate goal of joining him in vampire existence that would eliminate mortality and would eliminate vulnerability that made her liability in supernatural conflicts. The wedding in August of 2007 represented commitment and represented formal declaration that she was choosing Edward permanently despite Jacob's pain, and despite recognition that marriage meant hurting person who loved her genuinely and who deserved consideration even though she could not give him what he wanted. Her invitation to Jacob to attend wedding demonstrated either cruelty or naivety. Her desire to have him present at celebration of her marriage to Edward, suggesting that she did not fully comprehend depth of his pain, or suggesting that she hoped he could accept her choice and could maintain friendship despite romantic rejection. That wedding formalized and made public. Jacob's absence from wedding and his transformation into wolf and his running into wilderness rather than witnessing ceremony demonstrated that his pain exceeded his ability to perform happiness for her sake. His refusal to attend representing boundary and representing self-protection that was healthy, even though his departure hurt Bella, who wanted impossible scenario where everyone she loved could coexist peacefully and could celebrate her choices even when those choices caused them suffering. Her disappointment at his absence revealed her continued lack of understanding about impact of her decisions on others, or revealed her wish that love could exist without consequences and without casualties, when reality of choosing between two people meant that someone would be hurt regardless of how much she cared about both of them. The honeymoon pregnancy represented unexpected complication that altered timeline and altered circumstances in ways that made planned transformation immediate necessity rather than future event that could be delayed or could be negotiated. Her discovery that she was pregnant with hybrid child whose existence should have been impossible created new dimension to her choice. When carrying pregnancy to term meant likely death, and when terminating pregnancy meant destroying child that she immediately loved, despite never having planned for motherhood and despite pregnancy threatening her life in ways that made Edward's fears about her safety materialize in worst possible way. Her absolute refusal to terminate pregnancy, despite medical consensus that fetus would kill her, demonstrated commitment to motherhood and demonstrated willingness to sacrifice herself for child's chance at life. Her choice being controversial among readers who viewed her decision as noble self-sacrifice while others viewed it as reckless disregard for people who loved her and who would be devastated by her death, including Edward, whose existence depended on her survival, and including Charlie, whose only daughter's death would destroy him. Her insistence on her right to make decisions about her own body and her own pregnancy, despite being 18, and despite being advised by people with more experience and more knowledge, positioned her as autonomous agent whose choices deserved respect even when those choices seemed irrational or seemed destructive to observers who believed abortion was an obvious solution to pregnancy that threatened her life. Jacob's return during pregnancy, and his positioning himself as her protector against Edward's desperation and against family members who supported termination, represented alliance that was unexpected and was complicated when Werewolf, who loved her, supported her choice to risk death for hybrid baby, while Vampire, who loved her, wanted to terminate pregnancy to save her life. His presence during final weeks of pregnancy provided comfort and provided support that Edward's emotional devastation prevented him from providing. Jacob's ability to be present and functional while Edward spiraled into desperate attempts to convince Bella to abort created situation where werewolf enemy became ally and where vampire lover became opponent in conflict over Bella's body and Bella's choice about pregnancy that she insisted was hers alone to make. The birth that nearly killed her and the emergency transformation that saved her life represented culmination of choices that had defined her saga. Her willingness to die for child and her acceptance of vampire transformation that Edward performed to prevent her death, creating vampire existence that she had always wanted, but that came with cost that pregnancy and birth had extracted through destroying her human body before venom could repair damage and could complete transformation. Her awakening as vampire on September 13th represented successful transformation and represented survival that had been uncertain when delivery had caused catastrophic injuries that should have killed her before transformation could save her. Her unprecedented newborn control that allowed rational thought immediately after transformation and that allowed her to resist human blood despite being vampire measured in hours rather than decades, contradicted everything that vampire law suggested about newborn volatility and newborn bloodlust. Her self-control demonstrating either exceptional willpower or demonstrating that her transformation was unusual in ways that extended beyond hybrid pregnancy and extended into vampire capabilities that surpassed normal newborn limitations. Her ability to be around humans, including Charlie, within weeks of transformation, rather than requiring years of isolation and practice, represented advantages that made her transition easier and made her integration into vampire family seamless in ways that Jasper's ongoing struggles and Rosalie's difficult newborn phase suggested was not typical experience. Her gratitude toward Edward for transforming her and her happiness in vampire existence vindicated her choice and vindicated her insistence that vampire life was what she wanted rather than being sacrificed or being lost that others had projected onto her decision. Her lack of regret about surrendering humanity and her embrace of supernatural existence demonstrated that she had known herself and had known what she wanted despite others' attempts to convince her that she was making a mistake or that she would eventually regret choosing immortality over mortality that Edward and Jacob had both argued was more precious than she recognized. But her choice had consequences that extended beyond her own transformation. Jacob's heartbreak and his need to distance himself from her after wedding demonstrated that loving her had cost him years of pain and had prevented him from pursuing other relationships or pursuing other sources of happiness when his hope that she might choose him had sustained him through months of watching her choose Edward repeatedly. Her awareness that she had hurt him and her inability to prevent that hurt created guilt that vampire transformation did not eliminate. Her recognition that choosing Edward necessarily meant destroying Jacob's hope, creating moral complexity where right choice for herself was wrong, choice for person who loved her and who deserved better than being second option, whose value she acknowledged but whose love she could not fully return. The completion of her transformation and her integration into Cullen family represented ending of the one conflict and beginning of new existence. But love triangle that had defined Eclipse and that had split readers into opposing teams had not been resolved through her choice, because question remained whether she had chosen correctly and whether Edward represented better option than Jacob, when both had offered genuine love and when both had demonstrated worthiness through their devotion and through their willingness to sacrifice for her happiness, even when her happiness did not include them in ways they hoped. Jacob Black's imprint on Renesmee Cullen occurred in moments after her birth when he entered Cullen House, intending to kill Hybrid Child, whose existence had nearly killed Bella, and whose continued existence represented abomination that endangered both vampire family and werewolf pack, through creating unprecedented being, whose nature and whose future were unknown and potentially threatening. His intention to destroy infant dissolved instantly when his eyes met hers and when imprint bonds snapped into place with force that rewrote his emotional landscape and rewrote his priorities completely and irreversibly. His love for Bella transforming instantly from romantic attachment to familial affection, when imprinting redirected every protective instinct and every devotional impulse toward newborn Hybrid, whose existence became center of his universe in ways that conscious choice could not control or could not moderate. The imprint bond that governed werewolf romantic attachments was biological imperative rather than conscious choice, the mechanism being supernatural recognition of optimal mate, whose genetic compatibility and whose other qualities triggered response that wolves described as gravity shifting and as finding center that had been missing without conscious awareness that something was absent. The bond's intensity exceeded normal romantic love through involving complete devotion and complete commitment that could not be withdrawn or could not be diminished regardless of circumstances or regardless of beloved's feelings toward imprinted wolf. The one-sided nature of bond creating vulnerability when imprinted, wolf needed nothing from beloved except her existence and her eventual happiness that he would spend lifetime facilitating, regardless of whether that happiness included him romantically. The imprint's occurrence on Bella's daughter, rather than on stranger, created practical resolution to love triangle that had tormented all three participants across years of conflict. Jacob's transformation from rival to family member and protector, eliminating competition and eliminating tension that had characterized his relationship with Edward when both had wanted same woman and when their mutual hostility had threatened alliance and had threatened cooperation that newborn army and that Volturi threat had required. His new role as Renesmee's guardian, and eventually as a romantic partner when she matured, created connection between Cullens and Quileute, pact that was permanent and was intimate in ways that treaty alone could never establish, his presence in their lives being welcomed rather than being tolerated, when his devotion to Renesmee made him family rather than making him outsider, whose werewolf nature created instinctive vampire hostility. Edward and Bella's initial horror at discovering Jacob's imprint on their hours-old daughter represented parental protective response and represented concern about implications of bond that would eventually become romantic when Renesmee matured, even though Jacob's current role was purely protective and purely devoted to her well-being, without romantic or sexual dimension that would not develop until she was grown. Their eventual acceptance of imprint and their recognition that Jacob's bond meant Renesmee would always have devoted protector, who would prioritize her safety and her happiness above all other considerations, created peace and created gratitude that competed with discomfort about supernatural bond that had claimed their daughter before she could develop preferences or could choose her own romantic future. The controversy surrounding imprint divided readers who viewed it as satisfying resolution that gave Jacob happy ending and gave him person to love who would eventually love him back through biological imperative that made rejection impossible, while other readers viewed imprint as betrayal of Jacob's character arc and as cheap narrative solution that avoided addressing whether Bella had made correct choice through redirecting Jacob's feelings, rather than allowing him to process grief and allowing him to eventually find love with someone who chose him freely, rather than through supernatural compulsion. The debate about whether imprint represented growth or represented regression for Jacob's character reflected different interpretations of what constituted satisfying conclusion to romantic subplot that had consumed 3 books and had generated passionate reader investment in outcome. The practical advantages of imprint included eliminating conflict and eliminating Jacob's pain through biological mechanism that accomplished what years of conscious effort and conscious acceptance had failed to accomplish. His suffering ending instantly when imprint rewrote his emotional priorities and when loving Bella transformed into different kind of love that was familial rather than romantic. His happiness in new role and his complete lack of resentment toward Bella or toward Edward demonstrated that imprint had genuinely resolved his heartbreak rather than simply masking it. His devotion to Renesmee being absolute and being joyful in ways that his pursuit of Bella had been painful and had been characterized by constant awareness that he was second choice, whose love was acknowledged but not reciprocated at level he needed. But imprint also raised questions about consent and about autonomy when Renesmee's future romantic attachment to Jacob was predetermined through supernatural bond that she had no choice about, and that she could not reject regardless of what preferences she might develop or what other romantic options she might encounter as she matured. The imprint's guarantee that she would eventually return Jacob's feelings eliminated uncertainty and eliminated possibility of rejection, but also eliminated her freedom to choose different partner or to choose solitary existence if that was what she preferred when reaching maturity. That hybrid development accelerated beyond normal human timeline. Jacob's transformation from Bella's almost lover to Renesmee's devoted guardian represented complete redirection of life trajectory. His future that had been consumed with loving Bella and with hoping she would choose him, being replaced with future centered on protecting Renesmee. and on waiting for her to mature so that relationship could evolve from guardian-child dynamic into romantic partnership that Imprint promised would eventually develop. His patience and his willingness to wait years or decades for her to grow represented devotion that was selfless. When his own romantic fulfillment was postponed indefinitely for sake of allowing beloved to develop naturally and to reach maturity before relationships shifted into romantic dimension. The age difference between Jacob, who was 18 when Imprint occurred, and Renesmee, who was newborn, created discomfort despite understanding that hybrid aging was accelerated, and despite Jacob's assurance that relationship would remain protective rather than romantic until she was mentally and physically mature enough for adult relationship. The grooming concerns that some readers raised about older male supernatural being bonding with infant girl and waiting for her to grow reflected legitimate questions about power dynamics and about whether relationship built on imprint that occurred before beloved could consent or could develop independent preferences constituted healthy foundation for eventual romantic partnership. Edward's ability to read Jacob's thoughts provided reassurance that Jacob's intentions toward Renesmee were pure and were protective rather than being predatory. His confirmation that Jacob viewed Renesmee as child requiring protection rather than as future romantic partner during her development years, alleviating worse fears about Imprint's implications. But Edward's reading also revealed that Jacob's entire existence had reoriented around Renesmee in ways that made him dependent on her well-being and made him incapable of imagining future that did not include her. The intensity of bond creating new kind of obsession that replaced his obsession with Bella with potentially equally problematic devotion to child who had no choice about accepting his attention or his protection. The permanent alteration of pack dynamics through Jacob's imprint created political complications when his loyalty to hybrid child competed with pack loyalty, and when protecting Renesmee meant opposing Sam's orders and meant eventually breaking away to form own pack that prioritized Cullen alliance over traditional werewolf hostility toward vampires. His choice to leave Sam's pack and to create own pack with Seth and Leah Clearwater demonstrated that imprint superseded all other bonds and all other obligations. His willingness to become outcast and to sacrifice pack brotherhood for sake of protecting Renesmee, revealing depth of devotion that imprint created and revealing that biological imperative was more powerful than chosen family or chosen community. The resolution that imprint provided came with costs that some readers appreciated while other readers resented. The neat conclusion to love triangle through supernatural mechanism that eliminated Jacob's pain and that integrated him into Cullen family, feeling either satisfying or feeling like narrative cop-out, depending on whether reader valued Jacob's emotional journey or valued tidy ending that allowed all characters to achieve happiness without requiring genuine sacrifice or genuine loss. The question of whether Jacob deserved better than imprinting on ex-girlfriend's daughter remained divisive, when some viewed imprint as gift that gave him devoted partner, while others viewed it as consolation prize that prevented him from finding love with someone who had no connection to Bella and no reminder of years he spent loving woman who could not love him adequately in return. The imprint fundamentally changed nature of Team Edward versus Team Jacob debate through removing Jacob from romantic competition and through repositioning him as family member rather than as rival. but debate's emotional core about which love was better and which choice was right persisted beyond narrative resolution when readers' investments in preferred outcome were not resolved through plot development that used supernatural mechanism rather than using character growth or character realization. The imprint's convenience and its perfectness as solution created suspicion that author had avoided difficult emotional work of allowing Jacob to grieve and to heal and to eventually move forward without Bella, when supernatural bond provided shortcut that eliminated suffering, but also eliminated opportunity for meaningful character development through processing loss and through learning to live with heartbreak that did not have magical cure. Irina Denali's sighting of Renesmee from distance during December of 2007 created misunderstanding that would threaten everything when her observation of child who appeared to be vampire child playing in snow with Bella led her to conclude that Cullens had created immortal child whose existence violated most fundamental vampire law, and whose creation demanded immediate death for both child and creators according to Volturi enforcement that had destroyed entire covens for lesser violations of secrecy laws. Her grief over Laurent's death at hands of Quileute wolves during his attempted attack on Bella months earlier created resentment toward Cullens, whose protection of human had led to Laurent's destruction. Her emotional state making her willing to report family who had been allies and had been extended family through Tanya's close friendship with Carlyle, when vengeance and grief overrode loyalty and overrode obligation to verify accusations before bringing Volturi attention to situation that might have innocent explanation. The immortal child law existed because historical precedents had demonstrated that frozen mental development combined with vampire strength created beings who were incapable of controlling impulses and incapable of maintaining secrecy when tantrums and emotional outbursts resulted in exposure and resulted in human deaths that threatened entire vampire civilization through revealing supernatural existence to populations who might organize against vampires if knowledge became widespread. The famous cases of immortal children had ended in massacres and had ended in exposure risks that required Volturi intervention to contain damage and to eliminate witnesses. The destruction of immortal children and their creators and entire covens who had knowledge of violations representing brutal enforcement that prioritized collective safety over individual mercy, or individual circumstances that might explain or might justify violations. Alice Cullen's vision of Volturi approaching with entire guard, including Aro and Caius and Marcus, and dozens of powerful vampires whose combined abilities and whose combined experience made them essentially invincible force that no single coven could oppose, successfully created immediate crisis and created recognition that confrontation was inevitable despite innocence and despite fact that Renesmee was hybrid rather than immortal child. Her vision's clarity and her vision's certainty about Volturi's intentions to destroy Cullens demonstrated that Irina's report had been believed and had triggered response that was designed to eliminate threat permanently rather than designed to investigate claims or to allow explanation that might prevent unnecessary violence. Alice's sudden departure with Jasper immediately after sharing vision created panic and created sense of abandonment when family's most valuable asset for planning and for anticipating Volturi strategies disappeared without explanation beyond cryptic message about finding witness and beyond instruction. to gather own witnesses who could testify about Reneme's true nature. Her desertion felt like betrayal, when her precognitive abilities would be essential for surviving confrontation with force that outnumbered them and outpowered them significantly. But her history of cryptic behavior and her history of seeing futures that required specific actions without explaining reasoning created faith that departure was strategic rather than being cowardice or being abandonment of family during their greatest crisis. The gathering of witnesses from vampire covens worldwide represented Carlyle's activation of relationships and friendships that 3 centuries of traveling and 3 centuries of helping other vampires had created. His reputation for compassion and his reputation for integrity, making vampires willing to risk Volturi displeasure through standing with Cullens, when most vampires avoided Volturi attention carefully, and avoided any situation that might bring Ancient Ones' scrutiny onto their own covens or their own activities. The Amazon Coven and the Irish Coven and the Egyptian Coven and the Romanian Coven and nomadic vampires from various continents arrived in Forks during December, with understanding that witnessing Renesmee and testifying about her growth would be dangerous but necessary when false accusation threatened to destroy family that had helped them or family that had shown them kindness during encounters across decades or centuries. Edward and Jacob's cooperation during crisis represented complete transformation of their relationship from rivals to allies, whose mutual love for Renesmee and whose shared commitment to protecting her superseded their previous hostility and superseded their complicated history regarding Bella, whose choice between them had been source of conflict that imprint had resolved through redirecting Jacob's devotion. Their planning together and their coordination of vampire witnesses and werewolf pack demonstrated that protecting Renesmee was priority that united them, despite their differences, and despite Edward's continued discomfort with Jacob's imprint creating future, where werewolf would eventually become his son-in-law through romantic relationship with his daughter. The Quileute Pack's decision to stand with Cullens against Volturi, despite werewolf instincts creating hostility toward vampires and despite risk that confrontation with Volturi would result in pack members' deaths, demonstrated loyalty and demonstrated that Jacob's imprint had created alliance that transcended treaty and transcended traditional enmity between species. Sam Yuli's agreement to coordinate with Jacob's splinter pack and to present United Werewolf Front alongside vampires represented unprecedented cooperation and represented recognition that Renesmee's innocence deserved protection regardless of her hybrid nature and regardless of supernatural politics that typically prevented such alliances. Bella's discovery of her shield ability during preparation for confrontation revealed that her transformation had enhanced mental protection that had made her immune to Edward's telepathy and immune to other mental gifts into active power that could be projected to protect others from psychic attacks that Volturi Guard members like Jane and Alec would use to incapacitate opponents before physical confrontation could occur. Her practice extending shield to cover multiple people simultaneously, and her development of control over shield size and shield strength represented crucial advantage that might allow them to survive initial assault. When Jane's pain illusion and Alec's sensory deprivation had been Volturi's primary weapons for subduing superior numbers or superior strength through disabling opponents mentally, before guards destroyed them physically. The December 31st confrontation in snow-covered field outside Forks brought Volturi guard of 40 vampires, whose presence represented overwhelming force and represented Volturi's preparation for battle rather than representing simple investigation, when their numbers exceeded what would be required for destroying single family accused of creating immortal child. Aro and Caius and Marca's leading guard personally demonstrated seriousness of accusation and demonstrated that Volturi wanted to witness destruction of lawbreakers firsthand, rather than delegating enforcement to guard members who typically handled lesser violations, their presence making negotiation more possible, but making violence more likely when ancient vampires' pride and ancient vampires' authority could not tolerate being summoned unnecessarily or being deceived about nature of violation. The confrontation's opening involved Aro's request to examine evidence personally through his tactile telepathy that allowed him to read every thought and every memory through physical contact. His examination of Edward's memories revealing Renesmee's hybrid nature and revealing her rapid growth and revealing that she was not immortal child, whose creation had been reported but was unprecedented hybrid, whose existence had not been anticipated in vampire lore or vampire history. His fascination with Renesmee and his curiosity about her abilities and her potential created complication when his desire to acquire talented vampires competed with his obligation to enforce laws. His assessment that hybrid child who could grow and mature did not violate spirit of immortal child prohibition, creating possibility for peaceful resolution that would allow Cullens to survive. The testimony from witnesses who had observed Renesmee growing over weeks or months provided evidence that she was not frozen in childhood, and provided evidence that she was capable of learning and was capable of self-control that immortal children had lacked. Their accounts establishing that hybrid nature made her fundamentally different from banned immortal children, whose existence had justified law's creation. Nawel's arrival with his history as 150-year-old hybrid who had reached maturity at 7 years of age and who had lived peacefully without exposing vampire existence, provided living proof that hybrids were not threat, and provided evidence that Renesmee would mature, rather than remaining eternally childlike with childlike lack of control. Irina's execution for false report represented Volturi's acknowledgement that accusation had been wrong, while simultaneously demonstrating their authority and their intolerance for wasting their time, or for bringing them to confront situation that did not actually violate laws they enforced. Her death at Caius's hands, despite her Denali sister's grief, demonstrated that Volturi mercy was limited and that even unintentional false reports carried consequences when Volturi's authority depended on their reputation for swift justice and their reputation for perfect enforcement that made vampires fear them and made vampires comply with laws rather than risking violations. The Volturi's departure without battle represented victory that was achieved through evidence and through testimony, rather than through violence that casualties on both sides would have resulted from when Cullen witnesses and werewolf allies would have fought despite being outnumbered, because protecting Renesmee was worth dying for according to those who loved her and those who had come to witness her innocence. The relief that followed their departure exceeded normal crisis resolution, because this confrontation had threatened total destruction of family, and had threatened Reneme's life, and had threatened exposure of supernatural world to humans. If battle in snow had created spectacle that nearby residents might witness or might investigate, Edward and Bella's survival with daughter intact and with family intact represented happy ending that Eclipse's love triangle resolution had pointed toward. Their vampire existence together with hybrid daughter and with Jacob as permanent fixture through imprint creating family structure that was complicated but was functional and was characterized by love and by commitment that transcended typical family dynamics. Jacob's position as Renesmee's protector and eventual partner integrated him into family permanently and eliminated rivalry that had characterized his relationship with Edward when both had wanted Bella's exclusive love and when both had believed other was wrong choice for her. The confrontation's resolution demonstrated that external threats and external dangers could unite formally opposed factions when protecting innocent required cooperation and required setting aside personal grievances or personal hostilities for sake of greater good that survival represented. The love triangle that had divided Team Edward and Team Jacob became irrelevant against existential threat that required all of them working together rather than competing against each other. Their combined strength and their combined commitment to Renee, demonstrating that family included chosen members and unlikely alliances when circumstances required protection and required unity against forces that would destroy them if they remained divided. The cultural phenomenon of Team Edward versus Team Jacob transcended simple preference for fictional character and became statements about values, and became reflection of what readers believed love should be when choosing sides meant declaring whether passion or stability mattered more, and whether intensity or compatibility represented truer foundation for lasting partnership. The debate's intensity and the debate's persistence across years after book's publication demonstrated that conflict resonated beyond story itself and touched something fundamental about how people understood romantic relationships and how people evaluated competing visions of what constituted ideal partnership when both options had appeal, and both options had legitimate arguments supporting their superiority over alternative that millions of readers defended with conviction that suggested personal investment rather than casual entertainment preference. Team Edward's position centered on belief that true love was consuming and was transformative, and required willingness to sacrifice everything for beloved when Edward's devotion and Edward's willingness to endure constant temptation for sake of being near. Bella demonstrated commitment that transcended practical considerations about healthy relationship dynamics or about power balance. Their interpretation of his protectiveness as romantic rather than controlling reflected values that prioritize safety and security over autonomy, when dangerous supernatural world made protection necessary and made Edward's interference in Bella's choices justified through genuine threats that his century of experience allowed him to recognize, while her human naivety prevented her from adequately assessing risks that vampire existence and vampire enemies created. The fantasy element of vampire romance and the appeal of eternal devotion and the promise of forever created narrative that was compelling, specifically because it was impossible in real human relationships where aging and death and changing circumstances made eternal commitment aspirational rather than achievable, when mortality imposed limitations that vampire transformation eliminated through crystallizing relationship in the eternal present, where partners would never grow apart through aging or through life stages that created distance. Team Jacob's position centered on belief that healthy love supported growth and supported autonomy, and involved partners who were equals navigating life together, rather than involving centuries-old protector managing vulnerable human, whose choices required supervision and required intervention to prevent self-destruction. Their interpretation of Jacob's warmth and Jacob's respect for Bella's decisions as superior to Edward's cold control reflected values that prioritized emotional health and mutual respect over intensity and drama, when comfortable partnership and genuine friendship provided better foundation for lasting relationship than obsessive attachment that bordered on addiction, where separation caused physical pain and where reunion felt like oxygen returning after suffocation. The human element of Jacob's love and the possibility of normal life with normal experiences, including aging together and raising children, created narrative that was compelling specifically because it was achievable and was grounded in reality rather than being supernatural fantasy that required surrendering humanity and required accepting permanent transformation that could never be reversed if regret developed or if losses became unbearable. The division between teams often reflected generational differences and reflected personal experiences with relationships. Older readers and readers who'd experienced controlling partnerships tending toward Team Jacob, while younger readers and readers who valued romantic intensity tending toward Team Edward, when life experience affected interpretation of behaviors that some viewed as romantic devotion, while others viewed as red flags indicating unhealthy dynamics that would become worse over time. As power imbalance solidified, and as controlling partner became more comfortable exerting authority over subordinate partner, whose autonomy was systematically eroded through thousand small restrictions justified as protection. The debate about whether Edward's watching Bella sleep without permission was romantic or was creepy became microcosm for larger debate about whether his actions demonstrated love or demonstrated possessiveness, when same behavior interpreted through different frameworks produced completely opposite conclusions about his character and his suitability as romantic partner, whose violation of privacy could be viewed either as devotion that could not stay away, or as stalking that ignored consent and ignored boundaries. The vampire versus werewolf dichotomy mapped onto older archetypes about dangerous lover versus safe lover, and about choosing passion over pragmatism, when literary tradition and cultural narratives had long explored tension between exciting partner who might destroy you and stable partner who would support you through life's challenges without creating additional drama or additional danger beyond what ordinary existence provided. Edward represented Heathcliff and represented Rochester and represented Byron's heroes, whose darkness and whose danger made them irresistible despite, or perhaps because of their capacity for destruction, their tortured souls requiring saving, and their intensity creating relationships that felt significant and felt epic in ways that comfortable partnerships could never match. When comfort seemed boring compared to constant emotional highs and lows that passionate, tumultuous relationships provided. Jacob represented wholesome alternative whose lack of danger made him seem boring to those who valued excitement, but made him seem superior to those who valued emotional safety and valued partnerships where violence and control were not romanticized as proof of devotion, when healthy relationships should not require constant drama or constant crisis to maintain interest or maintain intensity. The feminist critique of both options complicated debate through arguing that Bella's choice was Fool's choice when both relationships involved problematic dynamics and involved male characters whose behavior toward her demonstrated possessiveness and demonstrated attempts to control her decisions, even though their methods differed and their justifications differed in ways that made one seem protective, while others seemed manipulative despite both ultimately attempting to influence her choices rather than respecting her autonomy. Edward's overt control through disabling her truck and through attempting to prevent her friendship with Jacob, and through making decisions about her safety without consulting her, competed with Jacob's emotional manipulation through threatening suicide if she chose Edward, and through using his pain as weapon to make her feel guilty for loving someone else, when both tactics represented attempts to influence her choice through means other than simply being better partner and allowing her to decide freely without coercion or without pressure that made autonomous choice difficult or impossible. The defense of Bella's agency argued that her choice of Edward, despite his flaws and despite his controlling tendencies, represented autonomous decision made by a young woman who knew what she wanted and who pursued transformation and immortality actively rather than passively accepting Edward's preferences when she negotiated terms and when she insisted on vampire existence, despite his opposition that lasted through their entire relationship until pregnancy forced his hand. Her willingness to endure his protection and his interference represented calculated cost that she accepted for sake of being with him rather than representing victimization or representing lack of awareness about relationship dynamics when she explicitly acknowledged his controlling nature and explicitly chose to tolerate it because other aspects of relationship outweighed costs that his behavior imposed on her, freedom, and on her ability to make independent choices about risk and about relationships. The story's reflection of real relationship dilemmas made debate personal and made team affiliation feel significant when choosing between Edward and Jacob, required examining own values about what mattered in romantic partnership, and required acknowledging that different people prioritize different qualities when selecting partners and when evaluating whether existing relationships were healthy or were toxic. The recognition that both options had merit and both options had drawbacks made choice genuinely difficult, rather than making one option obviously superior when Edward's intensity and eternal devotion competed with Jacob's warmth and human compatibility in ways that made either choice defensible depending on what criteria were prioritized in evaluation and depending on what kind of life seemed more appealing, when immortality and mortality offered different experiences and different opportunities. The question of first love versus practical love emerged as central theme when Edward represented Bella's first love, whose intensity and whose timing made him irreplaceable, regardless of whether he was objectively better partner, while Jacob represented second love, who might have been first love in different circumstances, and who might have been chosen if Edward had never appeared, but who could not overcome advantage of being first to capture her heart completely, and being first to make her feel seen and special in ways she had never felt before. The debate about whether first loves were special because they were first, or whether they were simply formative experiences that maturity and growth would allow moving beyond divided readers who had married first loves from readers who had found better partners after initial relationships ended, and both groups projected their experiences onto Bella's choice when personal history affected interpretation of whether she made right decision or whether she chose familiar intensity over healthier alternative that required letting go of first attachment. The imprint resolution that gave Jacob his own happy ending satisfied some readers who wanted everyone to find love, while frustrating other readers who felt that Jacob deserved love that was chosen, rather than love that was biologically predetermined through supernatural mechanism that eliminated possibility of rejection, but also eliminated beloved's choice about whether to reciprocate feelings that imprint created without consent or without regard for preferences that Renesmee might develop. The convenience of resolution that allowed Bella to choose Edward without condemning Jacob to lonely, miserable existence felt either satisfying or unsatisfying, depending on whether reader valued tidy endings or valued emotional realism, when supernatural solution avoided difficult questions about processing rejection and about moving forward after losing love that seemed essential to continued existence, but that life required accepting and required transcending through time and through new experiences. The Team Edward versus Team Jacob debate ultimately revealed that readers wanted different things from romantic narratives and valued different qualities in romantic partners, when some prioritize passion and intensity, while others prioritize stability and compatibility, and both groups found textual support for their positions, because story genuinely presented both options as viable and presented both characters as worthy of Bella's love, even though she could choose only one, and choosing one necessarily meant rejecting other. The debate's continuation, years after series ended, demonstrated that conflict touched something real about how people understood love and understood choice, when fictional love triangle became vehicle for exploring personal values and personal experiences that made team affiliation feel meaningful beyond simple preference for character whose appeal was based on personality or based on narrative role. The division between teams represented division between competing visions of what love should provide and what relationships should look like, when Edward's model emphasized devotion and protection and eternal commitment that would never waver, while Jacob's model emphasized growth and autonomy and partnership between equals who supported each other without one dominating other through superior knowledge or superior capabilities. Neither vision was entirely right or entirely wrong, when both had strengths and both had weaknesses that made them suitable for different people in different circumstances at different stages of life, when needs and priorities shifted, and when what seemed romantic at 18 might seem controlling at 28, or when what seemed boring at 18 might seem comforting at 28, after experiences with intensity revealed costs that excitement imposed on stability and on emotional well-being. The story's refusal to villainize either option, and story's presentation of both Edward and Jacob as genuinely loving Bella and genuinely wanting her happiness, created space for debate and created legitimacy for both teams, when neither was presented as obviously wrong choice, and when both offered Bella different futures that had different appeals and different costs that made her decision consequential, rather than making it simple preference without stakes or without recognition that choosing one path meant foreclosing other path permanently, when both led to different destinations. The life Bella would have lived with Jacob Black existed only in imagination and in speculation about alternate timeline, where Edward never returned from Italy, or where Bella's heart had chosen differently when presented with the impossible choice between vampire eternity and human mortality. Her hypothetical future with werewolf representing path not taken and representing possibility that haunted readers who believed she made wrong decision when choosing Edward over Jacob meant choosing intensity over health and choosing fantasy over reality that could have provided genuine happiness without requiring death of her human self. The human existence she would have experienced included aging alongside partner whose own aging might be slowed by werewolf genetics, but whose mortality remained intact when shapeshifters could die from violence or from eventual old age that vampires never faced, their years together being numbered rather than infinite, and their time having weight and having urgency that immortality eliminated through removing scarcity that made moments precious. Her life on Quileute Reservation or in Forks near Reservation would have meant remaining close to Charlie and remaining integrated in his life rather than faking death or disappearing for decades before returning as adopted daughter or as niece in elaborate charade that vampire families performed when maintaining presence in human relatives' lives across generations. Her father's ability to watch her grow and to meet grandchildren and to participate in her adult life represented gift that choosing Edward eliminated, when transformation required severing human connections or maintaining them only at careful distance that prevented Charlie from noticing her lack of aging or noticing her changed nature that vampire existence imposed. The family dinners and the holidays and the ordinary interactions that human life allowed would have continued rather than ending with transformation that made her too dangerous or too different to spend casual time with father, whose presence she valued, even though their relationship was characterized by comfortable silence rather than by deep emotional intimacy. The children she could have had with Jacob represented loss that Rosalie mourned and represented experience that Bella claimed not to want, but that choosing Edward made impossible when vampire biology prevented pregnancy and prevented biological motherhood. That human life would have allowed if she had chosen differently. Her hypothetical children would have been human, or would have been shapeshifters carrying genetics that Jacob's lineage provided, their existence grounding her in human world and in community, rather than separating her into supernatural existence that required secrecy and required distance from normal human experiences that parenthood involved. The graduations and the weddings and the grandchildren that long human life could have provided represented timeline and represented progression through life stages that vampire stasis eliminated. When remaining forever, 18 or 19 meant never experiencing adulthood or middle age or wisdom that decades of living provided through accumulation of experiences that immortal repetition could not replicate. Her career possibilities and her educational opportunities would have been genuine rather than being performance when attending college as human meant actual learning and actual growth, rather than vampires' perfect memory-making education redundant exercise in maintaining cover story. Her potential work as teacher or as writer or as whatever profession interested her would have had meaning and would have had impact when helping humans or contributing to human society, felt purposeful rather than feeling like elaborate pretense that vampire existence required for maintaining secrecy. The ordinary satisfactions of human achievement and human contribution would have been available rather than being replaced with vampire existence that was fundamentally about hiding and about pretending and about existing outside human society while observing it from supernatural distance that prevented genuine participation. The simplicity and the warmth of life with Jacob would have meant easy affection and easy physicality without constant awareness of danger or constant vigilance about control, when his warm skin and his passionate nature and his lack of bloodlust meant that intimacy was uncomplicated and was spontaneous rather than requiring calculation and requiring restraint that Edward's vampire nature imposed on every interaction. The comfortable partnership and the genuine friendship that formed foundation of their relationship would have allowed growth together, rather than requiring Bella to transform into something fundamentally different in order to be with partner whose nature was incompatible with her humanity and whose existence was designed for killing, despite his choice to resist that design through vegetarian philosophy. Her hypothetical life's losses would have included immortality and would have included supernatural capabilities and would have included Cullen family whose wealth and whose sophistication and whose accumulated knowledge across centuries provided access to experiences and education that normal, middle-class human existence could never provide, when unlimited resources and unlimited time created opportunities that mortality and limited finances prevented. Her aging would have brought wisdom, but also would have brought physical decline and would have brought eventual death. That vampire transformation prevented her mortality, meaning that her time with Jacob would end either through her death or through his death, when werewolf genetics might extend his lifespan, but could not make him truly immortal in ways that vampires were immortal. The ordinariness of human life that some readers viewed as settling or viewed as choosing safety over adventure competed with other readers' interpretation that ordinary was not lesser and that human experiences had value precisely because they were temporary and were universal, when aging and mortality connected her to billions of humans, rather than separating her into elite supernatural existence that was fundamentally about being different and being apart. The quiet beauty of growing old together and of sharing human experiences, including parenthood, and including gradual accumulation of shared memories across decades, represented vision of love that was grounded and was achievable, rather than being fantasy that required supernatural transformation and required surrendering connection to humanity that defined her species and defined her original identity. The life Bella chose with Edward Cullen represented immortality and represented transformation that was irreversible once venom completed its work, and once her human heart stopped beating, and once her vampire existence began with enhanced senses and enhanced capabilities, an eternal youth that would never fade, regardless of how many centuries passed or how many decades she existed as supernatural being, whose nature was fundamentally predatory despite vegetarian lifestyle that controlled but could not eliminate instincts that vampire biology created. Her eternity with Edward meant endless time together without fear of separation, through death and without concern about aging, creating distance or creating incompatibility, when both would remain frozen at ages where transformation occurred, and both would experience world through vampire senses that were sharper and more intense than human perception allowed. The Cullen family that she gained through transformation provided instant belonging and provided sophisticated, educated family whose members possess gifts and possess centuries of accumulated knowledge that made conversations intellectually stimulating and made family dynamics complex in ways that typical human families could not match. When telepathy and precognition and empathic manipulation created awareness of each other that transcended normal family communication. Her position as Carlisle and Esme's daughter, and as Edward's wife, and as Renesmee's mother, and as sister to Alice and Rosalie and Jasper and Emmett, created network of relationships that were chosen rather than being biological, and that were strengthened through shared nature and shared experiences of transformation and shared commitment to vegetarian lifestyle that made them unusual among vampires. Her supernatural capabilities, including her shield that protected minds from psychic attacks, provided purpose and provided power that human existence could never offer, when her gift made her valuable and made her protector of family rather than being protected vulnerable human whose presence created danger rather than providing defense. Her enhanced strength and her enhanced speed and her enhanced senses that allowed her to experience a world with intensity that humans could not perceive created new appreciation for beauty and created new understanding of reality that existed beyond human awareness. When vampire vision saw colors that human eyes could not detect, and when vampire hearing detected sounds that human ears could not process. The wealth and the resources that Cullen family provided through Carlisle's centuries of investment and through Alice's stock market precognition eliminated financial concerns and eliminated practical limitations that constrained normal human lives. When unlimited money meant unlimited travel and unlimited education and unlimited ability to pursue interests without needing employment or needing to consider costs that made experiences inaccessible to middle-class humans. Her ability to see world and to experience cultures and to access art and music and literature without financial constraints represented privilege that human life with Jacob could not have provided, when his modest circumstances and his connection to reservation meant that resources were limited and that opportunities were constrained by practical realities of working-class existence. But her choice meant losses that were permanent and were irreversible, her humanity's death and her transformation into predator, whose instincts wanted human blood despite her control and despite her vegetarian commitment, created fundamental change in her nature that was not simply enhancement, but was replacement of what she had been with something different and something other that was no longer human. Regardless of how well she maintained human behaviors or human relationships, her inability to have additional biological children after Renesmee represented closure of possibility and represented finality when vampire body could not create life despite retaining appearance of fertility that crystalline structure concealed. Her surrender of sunlight and her need to avoid exposure that would reveal sparkling skin to humans meant that weather and geography constrained where family could live and how much time they could spend outdoors when sunny days required isolation, rather than allowing casual participation in human activities that sunlight facilitated. Her need to drink blood, whether animal or human, meant that sustenance was hunt rather than being meal, and that feeding was violent act rather than being nourishment, when even vegetarian vampires killed for food despite choosing animal victims rather than human victims. Her eternal youth meant frozen existence at 18 or 19 when transformation occurred. Her appearance and her physical age remaining constant, while her actual age increased across decades and centuries and millennia if she survived that long. When immortality meant endless repetition and meant watching human world change, while she remained static and remained observer rather than participant in human history that continued without her. The question of whether eternal existence would eventually become boring or would eventually become burden rather than gift remained unanswered when vampires who tired of immortality could choose death through provoking Volturi or through other means, but commitment was essentially permanent unless active choice to end existence was made. Jacob's eventual happiness with Renesmee when she matured represented future, where Werewolf, who had loved Bella, found partner through imprint rather than through choice, and where his devotion and his protection of Bella's daughter created family connection that was permanent even though romantic relationship between Bella and Jacob had ended. His position as Renesmee's guardian and his eventual position as her romantic partner when she reached maturity created complicated family dynamics where Bella's former almost lover became her son-in-law through supernatural bond that had resolved love triangle through redirecting Jacob's feelings rather than requiring him to process loss and move forward without Bella in his life. Edward and Bella's forever included daughter, and included Jacob, and included Cullen family, and included eternity of experiences and learning and travel that immortality allowed, when unlimited time meant unlimited possibilities for growth and for exploration. Even though growth was psychological rather than physical, when bodies remained frozen while minds accumulated experiences, their love that had seemed impossible during human years became sustainable during vampire years, when both possessed same nature and same capabilities and same vulnerabilities that created equality impossible during Bella's human phase, when Edward's strength and Edward's experience created power imbalance. The recognition that both paths had beauty and had pain emerged through reflection on what each choice provided and what each choice cost. When choosing Edward meant gaining eternity but losing humanity, while choosing Jacob would have meant keeping humanity but losing supernatural existence that provided capabilities and experiences that mortality could never offer. Some losses were necessary for certain gains when having both was impossible, and when life required choosing between mutually exclusive options that both had merit and both had drawbacks, making neither choice clearly superior to other in absolute terms, even though personal values and personal priorities might make one choice clearly superior for specific individual making decision. The story's refusal to villainize either choice or to present one option as obviously correct demonstrated that love and life involved trade-offs and involved recognizing that perfect option did not exist when every choice involved surrendering possibilities in exchange for different possibilities that chosen path provided. Both Edward and Jacob got versions of what they wanted, even though neither got exactly what they originally pursued. Edward's desire for Bella and desire to transform her eventually being fulfilled despite his resistance and despite complications, while Jacob's love for Bella transformed to different love for Renesmee, that imprint created when biological imperative redirected his devotion toward partner who would eventually reciprocate rather than remaining forever second choice. But Bella's choice echoed through all their lives in ways that were permanent and in ways that shaped futures that diverged from what might have been if different decisions had been made at critical moments when Edward returned, or when Jacob confessed, or when Bella chose vampire transformation, despite alternatives that were available, if she had valued them sufficiently to choose them over Edward's eternity. The path not taken remained forever unknown, and remained a forever possibility that existed only in imagination and in speculation about whether different choice would have led to greater happiness or to greater regret, when either option involved trade-offs that made judgment impossible without actually living both lives and comparing outcomes that could never be compared, because choosing one eliminated other. And so we return to the question that divided a generation and that transformed simple story about girl choosing between two boys into cultural phenomenon that revealed what we believe about love and what we value in partnerships that define our lives and shape our futures in ways both profound and permanent. Team Edward or Team Jacob? The debate that we walk through tonight across all acts and across all moments where choice mattered and where Bella's heart pulled her in directions that were opposite and incompatible, demonstrated that both sides had legitimate claims and both sides represented genuine love that deserved consideration, even though only one could be chosen, and only one could provide future that Bella would actually experience, while other remained forever hypothetical and forever wondering what might have been if different decision had been made at critical juncture when returning vampire competed with present werewolf for affection that could not be divided equally between them. The answer to which choice was correct depends entirely on what you value and depends entirely on what you believe love should provide. When some of us prioritize passion and intensity and eternal devotion that Edward offered through his century of waiting and his willingness to fight his nature constantly for sake of being near beloved, whose blood called to predatory instincts that love required him to resist every moment they spent together, his protection and his wealth, and his promise of forever created fantasy that was compelling precisely because it was impossible in normal human relationships where mortality and aging imposed limitations that vampire transformation eliminated through crystallizing existence in eternal present, where love would never fade through time or through circumstances that changed mortal partnerships across decades of living and growing and eventually dying. Others among us prioritize emotional health and prioritize autonomy and prioritize partnerships between equals who grow together rather than relationships where centuries of experience and supernatural capabilities create power imbalance that makes genuine equality impossible regardless of love or regardless of intentions, when one partner possesses knowledge and possesses strength that other partner can never match without fundamental transformation that eliminates original identity and replaces humanity with something other. Jacob's warmth and his respect for Bella's choices and his offering of human life that included aging and children and ordinary experiences that vampire existence eliminated created grounded realistic vision of love that was achievable and was healthy in ways that Edward's intensity and Edward's control suggested problematic dynamics that some readers romanticized, while other readers recognized as warning signs that experience had taught them to notice and to avoid. Bella made her choice, and lived with its consequences across transformation and across eternity, that her decision created, her selection of Edward over Jacob, representing active choice rather than representing passive acceptance when she pursued vampire existence despite opposition and despite recognition of costs that transformation imposed on her humanity and on her relationships with human family, who would eventually need to be left behind or maintained at distance that prevented genuine connection that mortality had allowed. Her happiness in vampire existence and her lack of regret about surrendering mortality vindicated her decision. From her perspective, even though readers continued debating whether she chose wisely or whether different choice would have provided better life and better partnership, that honored her humanity rather than requiring its sacrifice. But the debate continues because both options had merit, and both options represented different definitions of what love should be. When Edward's model emphasized devotion and protection, an eternal commitment that would last across centuries without diminishing, while Jacob's model emphasized growth and compatibility and human connection that grounded rather than elevated, and that allowed participation in human world rather than requiring separation into supernatural existence that was fundamentally about hiding and about pretending to be something other than what vampire nature actually was. Some saw Edward's love as truest form of devotion that transcended practical concerns and transcended healthy relationship dynamics through demonstrating willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own desires about her mortality, for sake of being with her across eternity, that his transformation would provide once she became vampire, whose nature matched his own. Others saw Jacob's love as healthiest expression of partnership that respected autonomy and supported growth and offered life that did not require fundamental transformation or require surrendering core aspects of identity for sake of being with partner, whose nature was incompatible with original self, that transformation would destroy permanently. The conflict that defined a generation of readers and that created passionate defenders of both sides represented more than simple preference for fictional character and represented examination of personal values about relationships and about what constitutes meaningful partnership when both options offered love, but offered different kinds of love that appealed to different needs and different visions of what romantic future should include when evaluating trade-offs between security and excitement and between intensity and stability. The story's presentation of both Edward and Jacob as genuinely loving Bella and genuinely worthy of her love created legitimacy for both teams and created debate that had no definitive answer, because answer depended on subjective values rather than depending on objective assessment of superior option that one choice clearly represented over other. Tonight we remembered why both sides fought so hard and why debate persisted years after books ended, and why choosing team felt significant beyond casual entertainment preference, when taking side meant declaring beliefs about love and about relationships, and about what mattered most in partnerships that would define lives and shape futures in directions that diverge based on which path was chosen, at moment when decision was required, and when both options were available and both options were defended by a person who loved her genuinely. Two boys who loved the same girl with genuine devotion and genuine commitment to her happiness, even when her happiness did not include them in ways they hoped, and even when loving her meant accepting rejection or accepting secondary position in heart that could not accommodate both of them equally. One girl whose impossible choice between vampire eternity and werewolf humanity represented decision that millions of readers evaluated and judged and debated based on their own experiences and their own values about what love should provide and what relationships should look like when functioning optimally and supporting both partners rather than requiring one partner's complete transformation or complete submission. One story that presented choice without declaring winner and without villainizing either option in ways that made debate possible and made both teams defensible when textual support existed for both interpretations, and when Bella's decision did not invalidate arguments that Jacob represented better choice, even though Edward was choice she made and choice she lived with across transformation, that made reversal impossible. Perhaps that is how it should be when love is complicated and when choosing partner involves evaluating competing goods, rather than choosing between obvious right answer and obvious wrong answer that everyone could agree upon regardless of personal values or personal experiences. Perhaps the question was never meant to be resolved definitively, but was meant to be examined and debated and considered from multiple perspectives that reveal different truths about what we value and what we believe makes relationships worthwhile across time, that is either limited by mortality or extended through supernatural transformation that eliminates death but also eliminates growth that aging provides. Rest now with the story complete, but the question unanswered in ways that allow you to hold your own beliefs and your own team affiliation without judgment and without definitive resolution that would eliminate continued discussion and continued examination of choice that mattered because both options had beauty and both options had costs that made decision genuinely difficult rather than obviously simple. Sleep well, gentle souls, carried by journey through greatest fandom war that young adult literature has known. Good night.